Hello, I'm John Kay of Steppenwolf. Welcome to my podcast From Rockstar to Wildlife Advocate. The last episode ended with my parents and I arriving in Santa Monica, California in the late summer of 1964 after a 4-day road trip from our previous home in Buffalo, New York. Soon, the belongings we had towed in a U-Haul trailer were in a rented apartment on 6th Street, and I headed to the beach to lollygag in the sand and get some sun. After a couple of days of this idleness, I had a sunburn and was ready to look for some nightlife. I didn't find anything in Santa Monica, but in a local paper I saw an ad for the New Balladeer, a folk music club in West Los Angeles. Well, West LA was too far to walk, but after a 20-minute bus ride, I found the New Balladeer and gave it the once-over. There seemed to be enough chairs, none of which matched, to seat maybe 120 people. There was a small stage at one end and a hangout sitting area in the back of the room next to a small kitchen with an espresso machine. Angelo, the owner, and Morgan Cavett, the manager, were friendly and invited me to play at their Hoot, short for Hootenanny, the following Sunday. My bid at the Hoot went over fairly well, and I started going there regularly. Among the performers that frequented the place were David Crosby, who sang well and played a fine 12-string guitar, Jim McGuinn, who later became Roger McGuinn, and Michael Clark, who played bongos when I first saw him. I later learned these three, along with Gene Clark and Chris Hillman, were forming The Byrds, an excellent folk rock band that became quite successful. Others I met at the Balladeer were Brian McLean, a guitarist who became a member of the band Love with Arthur Lee, as well as Bobby Kimmel and Kenny Edwards, who later formed the Stone Ponies with Linda Ronstadt. One performer who bombed regularly was comedian Pat Paulson. His humor was so dry I needed a drink after he was done. However, in the late 60s, he became a regular on the highly rated Smothers Brothers TV show, and he killed. I became a fan of his, especially after he began his mock presidential campaign. Now, Taj Mahal, who I had met in July at the Newport Folk Festival, had migrated to L.A. with Jesse Lee Kincaid, who's originally from California, and those two also performed at the Balladeer. A couple of times they and I played the club the same night. They were excellent, and together with Ry Cooder, drummer Ed Cassidy, who later formed the band Spirit, and bassist Gary Marker, they soon formed the Rising Sons, a very fine band. They then recorded an album for Columbia, which wasn't released for years and years. As I spent more and more time at the Balladeer, Morgan Cavett, the club's manager, and I got to know one another, and we became friends. For a long time, he remained the only person I met who was actually from Los Angeles. In the 50s, his father had won an Oscar for screenwriting The Greatest Show on Earth, a film with numerous Hollywood stars and the Ringling Brothers' Barnum and Bailey Circus. So Morgan grew up in the Hollywood milieu, went to Hollywood High School, knew a lot of the area's history, and also knew his way around the Hollywood Hills. One evening, he took me up the winding roads to the top of those hills for a spectacular nighttime view of Los Angeles. The massive sea of lights below was magical and made a lasting impression on me. It was also Morgan who made me aware of the Troubadour in West Hollywood, which booked well-known national acts. On Monday nights, the Troubadour had hootenannies, and I decided to give it a try. When I showed up, I was put on a list of scheduled performers. They didn't know me, so I was to go on last. By the time I hit the stage, it was late, and there were perhaps a dozen people left in the audience. Well, I did my bit anyway, some blues, Lightnin' Hopkins songs, etc. The response was hardly overwhelming. The old bar band's snarky remark, "Thank you for that rousing round of indifference," came to mind. But it was not a complete waste of time. A fellow named Butch heard me, and he introduced me to Tony Mafia, a Sicilian and Native American, who was forming a folk group called Mafia's Men. He sang and played classical guitar, but was also a painter, whose work apparently was well known. One thing led to another, and I wound up in Mafia's Men along with Butch and a fourth member by the name of Jim. Doug Weston, owner of the Troubadour, wanted to manage the band and let us rehearse at the club during the day. When he thought we were ready to face an audience, he booked us to perform at a Jews for Johnson political rally in the Jewish neighborhood on Fairfax Avenue across from Cantor's, a 24-hour delicatessen that musicians frequented at all hours of the night. This was in the fall of 1964 during President Johnson's re-election campaign. His vice president, Hubert Humphrey, was to appear at this rally, and we were to provide some music before his arrival. Well, the gathered multitude received our efforts with stony silence, and then Eddie Fisher, a well-known singer, stepped up to the microphone. Some women in the crowd started yelling, "Sing Oh My Papa, Eddie," which was one of Eddie's greatest hits.
Oh, my Papa, to me he was so wonderful.
But he was there to pitch for the Johnson-Humphrey campaign and tried to ignore their pleadings. He attempted to state his case, but the women wouldn't let up, so he finally turned to me with my guitar and said, "Oh, my Papa," in B-flat. Well, I played that chord, and he started singing. But I didn't know the rest of the chords, so I quit playing a few beats later rather than lead him into uncharted territory. As soon as Eddie finished singing, Men in Black, the Secret Service, surged onto the stage and pushed everyone aside to make a path for Mr. Hubert Humphrey. After the vice president finished his speech, "My fellow Americans, as I gaze across this gathered assembly," etc., etc., he was quickly led away, and we were able to leave. After this discouraging debut, Tony asked Doug Weston, "What do you have next for us, a Goys for Goldwater rally?" As you may know, Senator Goldwater was the Republican presidential candidate that year. Well, Mr. Weston didn't think that was funny, but he did book the group for a couple more gigs, which were no more successful than our Jews for Johnson fiasco. Shortly thereafter, Jim left the group to move somewhere north, and Butch and I decided to leave as well, and so Mafia's Men was no more. Mr. Weston then offered me the Troubadour's dishwasher position. Not exactly what I had aspired to, but it paid a few bucks, and more importantly, I got to see and hear pros perform night after night. When my dishwashing efforts were deemed subpar due to my poor eyesight, I was moved to the box office. However, my most rewarding job came when, for a short time, tickets had assigned seats, and I became the Troubadour's only usher. While guiding people to their seats, some ticket holders expressed their appreciation for my services by pressing some folded bills into my palm, and I, in turn, expressed my appreciation by substantially improving the location of their seats. Well, money matters, of course, particularly when it's in short supply. The main benefit of working at the Troubadour, though, was that I learned from the artists that performed there. In addition to acts like the Travelers 3, the Journeymen, and Bud and Travis, I saw the Smothers Brothers, Joe and Eddie, who had a hit with "There's a Meetin' Here Tonight," renowned Spanish flamenco guitarist Sabicas, and singer-songwriter Gail Garnett, whose "We'll Sing in the Sunshine" was an international hit. I also recall hearing Odetta and how impressed I was with her powerful voice and passionate delivery. Her engagement was at the end of December, and at a New Year's Eve party, I met Odetta's well-known guitarist Bruce Langhorne. He was friendly and easygoing, and we talked a while about his work with other artists. I had no idea that I was talking with Mr. Tambourine Man, the man who Bob Dylan had in mind when he wrote that song in February 1964, I believe.
Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. In the jingle jangle morning, I come following you.
13 days after the New Year's Eve party, January 13th, 1965 to be exact, Bruce would play on Bob Dylan's much celebrated Bringing It All Back Home album, which includes Mr. Tambourine Man. That song was also being played by the Byrds, who had formed by then, and who in March 65 made their debut at Ciro's on Sunset Strip. Ciro's was a Hollywood supper club frequented by the stars in the 40s and 50s. Now in the 60s, artists like Ike and Tina Turner played the club. Rita, who ran a tiny store around the corner from the Troubadour, and I went to see the Byrds at Ciro's several times. There was no admission charge, but as soon as you sat down at one of the tables, a waitress would appear and charge you for the 2 mandatory overpriced drinks you had yet to order. So, with no extra coin to spare, Rita and I did what people like Vito and the Freaks did. These guys are another story altogether, namely stay on the dance floor and dance. The Byrds sounded fine, and we always had a great time. One night, while Rita and I were on the dance floor as usual, Bob Dylan appeared, got up on stage, joined the Byrds, and played harmonica on a few songs. By then, the single Mr. Tambourine Man was already #1 nationwide and a massive hit. Back at the Troubadour, the artist that connected with me most was Hoyt Axton. He seemed to play the club every few weeks. I liked his voice and bluesy guitar playing, and also his songwriting. Every time he played The Pusher, he brought down the house.
You know I smoked a lot of grass, and I popped a couple of pills now.
I soon learned that song as well and started playing it regularly.
But I've never touched nothing that my spirit could give.
Little did I know I would sing it for decades to come. One night in 1969, Steppenwolf was well established by then. Jutta and I were at the Troubadour Bar when Hoyt Axton sat down and said, "You're the Steppenwolf singer, right?" I said, "Yes." And he continued, "You guys will always be special to me." I was living in Laurel Canyon, and things were tight. I already had 2 rent past due notices, and nothing but bills in the mail. And then one day I went down to my mailbox and found more bills, but also an envelope with a $50,000 check of songwriting royalties for your recording of The Pusher. I have to say that I was more than pleased to hear this from the man who inspired me. We were both smiling and shook hands. Flipping the calendar pages back to 1965, when I was still working at the Troubadour, I recall 2 instances of special note. Both were unplanned and occurred after hours, when only the staff and musicians were still in the club. One was the night Roger Miller, whose King of the Road was a major hit at the time, came to hobnob with whoever the headliner was. Who that was, I can't recall.
2 hours of pushing broom buys a 8 by 12 4-bedroom. I'm a man of means by no means, king of the road.
I do remember there was a lot of laughter. Roger had a wicked sense of humor, as demonstrated in his lyrics and recordings, and that guitarist Thumbs Carlyle was part of Roger's entourage. Thumbs played the guitar almost like a piano. That is, he placed the guitar flat on his lap and then fingered the notes on the neck with his left hand. I had never seen anything like it, and this wasn't a gimmick. He was an amazing player. Speaking of which, legendary T-Bone Walker, whose guitar playing influenced B.B. King, Chuck Berry, Jimi Hendrix, Eric Clapton, and others, showed up at the Troubadour one night after the regular show had ended. Once again, I can't recall who the headliner was, but it doesn't matter. It was T-Bone who got my attention. I knew he wrote the blues classic Stormy Monday and how much of a musical pioneer he was, so it was a privilege to see and hear him play. In 1987, T-Bone was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. By the way, if you're curious about any of the artists I've mentioned in connection with my time at the Troubadour, go to YouTube, where every one of these artists is represented. Now, during my last few months at the Troubadour, I also occasionally played at the New Belvedere. My friend Morgan Cavett, who was still the club's manager, then decided to give San Francisco a try and moved to the city by the bay, where the music scene was growing rapidly. Angelo, the Belladere's owner, then offered me Morgan's old job, and for a couple of months I was looking after the place while making espressos and cappuccinos for the usual crowd. But I soon felt this wasn't my true calling, and decided to make my way back to the East Coast. What I hoped to find and do there is still a puzzling mystery to me. In any event, I bought a duffel bag at a Army surplus store, stuffed it with my sleeping bag and a few clothes, grabbed my guitar, and in early July hit the road, so to speak. Not enough money for a Greyhound bus ticket? I planned to hitchhike, coast to coast. Well, getting a ride on the LA freeway system is a non-starter, but a girlfriend was kind enough to drive me out of LA and drop me somewhere near San Bernardino. Later on Interstate 40, I got a ride from a guy going to Detroit who dropped me in Gary, Indiana. From there, I made it to Buffalo and went straight to the Limelight Coffee House, which was still pretty much as I remembered it, but it seemed to be barely hanging on. The Buffalo gang of folkies I knew had scattered in my absence, and I only found one or two familiar faces. The Golden Boar had closed, as did other places I had known, and there was no point in staying. Years later I wrote, "Nobody Lives Here Anymore," about my return to Buffalo, a song featured on my Sportin' Life album.
I'm back in town to find my favorite foe, but nobody knows, and nobody cares, 'cause nobody plays here, nobody stays here, nobody lives here anymore.
So, with Buffalo off the list, I hitched my way to Toronto, which proved to be one of the best moves I've ever made. During my roughly 12 months in California, the Yorkville Village neighborhood had become a coffeehouse music club mecca. I walked the area and counted 17 different clubs featuring folk music and rock bands, and all the clubs seemed to be doing business. On Avenue Road, there was the Village Corner, the Cellar, which was a jazz club, the Night Owl, the Avenue Road Club, the Devil's Den, the Half Beat, the New Gate of the Cleve, and the Purple Onion. Around the corner on Yorkville Avenue was the Riverboat, the Mouse Hole, the Penny Farthing, the El Patio, the Minor Bird Club, Chez Monique, and one of the original coffee houses, the 71 Club. On Cumberland Street, one short block over, was Charlie Brown's, and the inn on the parking lot. Finally, in the alley connecting Yorkville and Cumberland was the Kiki Rouge, a discotheque, which, like all the village clubs, only served coffee. Or so they claimed. I was contemplating what to do next when I passed the Half Beat again, and I heard a fellow singing and playing his guitar. I thought I could do better than that, so I went inside and found the manager, named Bill. He listened to my pitch and then had me play a few tunes. I passed the audition and got the gig. 3 or 4 sets on weekends for $8 per night, if memory serves, which was more than enough to keep me fed. When I told him I didn't have a place to stay, he said, "Well, there's a rollaway in the basement and a bathroom upstairs." So I went downstairs, unrolled my sleeping bag, and settled in. The gig was easy and the listeners friendly. I played a few blues chestnuts and songs like Ramblin' Boy by Tom Paxton, but I also played Hoyt Axton's The Pusher and Red, White, and Blue Was His Shroud, a song about fallen soldiers being shipped home from Vietnam. No one in Toronto had heard these songs, and that was in my favor. A week or so had passed when a young fellow said, "We're having a jam session at Vicki Taylor's place. You should come. It'll be fun." Okay, well, where is it? It's above the Night Owl Club. I took a couple of my harmonicas and joined some folkies making music in Vicki's apartment, and then had a really good time. Vicki and I got on so well that she invited me to stay, an invitation I gladly accepted. She was a folk singer herself and regularly played at the Mouse Hole Club, while I continued playing at the Half Beat. One evening, Bill, the Half Beat's manager, said he invited a few players for a private get-together upstairs. The participants I remember were Jim McCarthy of the Dirty Shames, a popular Canadian group that later moved to New York, country singer Johnny C. from Nashville, who was playing at Toronto's Edison Hotel, and Art Ayre, pianist in the Sparrows, a rock band that was playing at the Devil's Den. Art liked my harmonica playing and invited me to sit in with the Sparrows. I took him up on that, and the next day joined the Sparrows on a couple of Jimmy Reed songs, Bright Lights, Big City and Big Boss Man. We not only sounded good together, but the audience also seemed to like our combined sound. This initial meeting laid the groundwork of what later became a permanent joining of forces when I became a member of the Sparrows. But that was still a couple of months away, and in the meantime other totally unexpected events took place. Johnny C. liked a couple of songs I played at the Half Beat and invited me to play them with his band at the Edison Hotel. When that guest appearance went well, Johnny said, "I'd like my manager to hear you. I'm playing at the Bitter End in New York in a couple of weeks, and he'll be there. If you can make it to New York by then, I'll introduce you to him." Well, as luck would have it, the Newport Folk Festival in Rhode Island was about to play July 22nd through the 25th, a week or so before Johnny's gig at the Bitter End in Manhattan. Having greatly enjoyed the festival the previous year, I thought, if I can make it to Newport, stay for the festival, and afterwards get to New York somehow, I'd be able to see Johnny and his manager at the Bitter End. Bill at the Half Beat was okay with my plan and said I'd still have my little gig when I got back. So I took my guitar and went off to Rhode Island, hitchhiking once again. As best as I recall, I made it there in one day. What I witnessed at the festival has become musical history and much written about, namely, Bob Dylan's decision to go electric. That occurred on Sunday, the last day of the festival. Yes, there was booing and shouting when Dylan launched into "I Ain't Gonna Work on Maggie's Farm No More," backed by the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, and with Michael Bloomfield playing scorching lead guitar. It's been said that while the boos came from outraged folk music purists who were shocked by this, the yelling came from those who couldn't hear Dylan's voice because of a terrible sound mix. I had seen the Butterfield Band 2 days earlier at the afternoon blues workshop, where I also witnessed an altercation between Alan Lomax, the host of the workshop, and Albert Grossman. It became so physical that those two wound up rolling in the dirt while trying to punch one another. I had learned from Alan Lomax's Library of Congress field recordings, and he was a true champion of the blues, and that Grossman managed a dozen different artists, including Bob Dylan and the Butterfield Blues Band. So why Alan, who introduced the Butterfield Band, and Albert, who managed the Butterfield Band, came to blows before the first note was played, it's still a mystery to me. I do know that I loved the band's sound and Paul Butterfield's outstanding blues harp playing. So when these same guys backed Dylan on Sunday night, I was all for it. But yes, the sound was terrible, and the booing didn't help, of course. But these events were only a fraction of what took place over the festival's 4 days. I enjoyed seeing some of my blues favorites like Lightnin' Hopkins, Son House, and the remarkable Mississippi John Hurt, whose self-taught finger-picking guitar playing was so astounding that Dave Van Ronk wrote a song entitled, "Have You Heard John Hurt Play?"
Did you hear John Hurt play his Creole bell? Spanish fandango that he loves so well. Did you love John Hurt? Did you shake his hand? Did you hear him play his Candyman?
The fact that Hurt was 72 years old at the time made his flawless playing even more remarkable. I also heard Ian and Sylvia, whose songs Someday Soon and Four Strong Winds I really liked, and the Jim Kweskin Jug Band with Maria Mulder, who were a lot of fun. There were several more artists whose performances I enjoyed, but one, actually two I should say, that really got to me were Richard and Mimi Farina. Mimi was Joan Baez's sister and married to Richard, whose songwriting truly connected with me. So much so that I recorded his song Bold Marauder on my Forgotten Songs and Unsung Heroes album in 1972.
Hey, ho, hey, I am a bold marauder, and it's hi, ho, hey, I am a white destroyer.
Now back at the festival, I had befriended two young women from Brooklyn. When they heard my plans to meet Johnny C. at the bitter end, they offered to take me with them to New York. During our drive, as we became more acquainted, they invited me to stay with them in Brooklyn. We arrived there mid-afternoon. I relaxed at their place until evening, and then took my guitar and rode the subway to Manhattan and Greenwich Village. Once I passed Washington Square, where some folkies were playing their guitars and banjos, I found the bitter end on McDougal Street. This was where Johnny C. would play later that week. Now that I had my bearings, I went further down the road past the Gaslight Cafe and also the Cafe Wah, where the following year Jimi Hendrix would play, then still known as Jimmy James. One of the hole-in-the-wall places I passed on McDougal was called the Cafe Why Not? A barker out front was trying to coax the passing tourists into hearing real folk singers inside. I went in to take a look and found the cafe so narrow that it had tables on only one side of the room. At the far end was a guy singing and playing his guitar. I found the man in charge and asked if he could use another real folk singer. He said, "After this guy finishes, take his place and play for 20 minutes, no longer." Well, my short set was deemed adequate, and Mr. X, I have no idea what his name was, said, "We don't have a cabaret license, so we can't pay performers. We're a basket house." I learned later there were several of those in the village. So after your set, you take this basket and work your way along the tables to collect tips. Also, and this is important, you and two other guys are doing 20-minute sets each, and when it's your turn again, you must play the same songs in the same order again. That will make people leave after an hour and make room for a new crowd. This place is so small that we need the turnover to make a profit. So, after my next set, I walked from table to table, waving my basket in front of the occupants until they got the message. This guy ain't going to move on unless I put some coin in the basket. The contributions were mainly quarters and dimes, but after 4 or 5 sets, that came to around $12, enough for my modest needs at the time. During the 40 minutes in between my sets, I walked around the village, got a slice of pizza from a stand, and listened to music coming out of various coffee houses. After a couple of days of this routine, Johnny C. opened at the bitter end, and I quit my why not engagement and went to meet him.
Here I am walking down this highway. I guess I really look a sight. I don't believe I done my suit no favor, sleeping in that old haystack last night.
He was glad to see me and said he'd introduce me to his manager after the show. We were in the dressing room talking when I noticed a diminutive figure pacing back and forth at the far end of the room while muttering to himself. I was about to ask, "Who's that?" when we heard an announcement in the showroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, doing a guest set for us this evening, would you please welcome Mr. Woody Allen?" He had been rehearsing new material to try out, hence the muttering. Well, after Johnny's show, I met his manager and played him 2 or 3 songs. He listened carefully and then, very tactfully, said something like, "You have talent, but you need more time to develop it." It wasn't what I wanted to hear, but I later realized that he was right. At that point, I was still honing my skills and learning from the pros. I thanked him and Johnny and then took the subway back to Brooklyn. Next day, one of the women drove me to where I could hitch a ride going north. Was lucky and got a lift from a friendly off-duty New York State trooper who was going to Buffalo. From there, I made it to Toronto, where Bill was true to his word and let me play at the Half Beat again. Vicki Taylor was also glad to see me and invited me to stay at her place once more. My life in Yorkville Village became pretty easygoing. I made enough money to eat at the nearby diner or the pizza place next to the Half Beat, and around the corner on Yorkville Avenue was the Grab Bag, which had all kinds of goodies for those with an acute case of the munchies. Along the avenue were also several places with outdoor tables where I could sit and drink coffee while watching the suburbanites and tourists walk by. Strolling past the clubs in the evening, I heard music by other artists like Buffy St. Marie's passionate singing flowing out of the Purple Onion and Johnny Hooker's Boogie Children from downstairs at the new gate of the Cleve. The owner knew I played at the Half Beat and said, "Come on down to hear John Lee's sets." He played Boom Boom and Crawlin' King Snake and a couple of other numbers I knew, and then surprisingly went into Ray Charles's What I Say. That was interesting and definitely very different. And so it went for roughly 10 days, at which point my duds needed washing. I went up the street on Avenue Road to a coin laundry, which during my first visit hosted a completely naked guy who was waiting for his only set of clothes to finish in the dryer. Didn't bother me any. There were plenty of washers and dryers to go around. Late at night, musicians used the laundry for practicing their songs because the acoustics there made everybody sound better than they were. So all in all, my basic needs were met, but I began to think about my next move. Enter the man from England. I can't recall if I had set in with the Sparrows again, and this fellow witnessed that, but in any case, he told the Sparrows if I was to join them as their frontman, he would be able to book the band in England. The Sparrows debated the idea and then invited me to join their ranks. I had enjoyed jamming with these guys and gladly accepted their offer. The Englishmen then flew to the UK, ostensibly to book the band, but best as I recall, was never heard from again. No matter, he had served his purpose as far as I was concerned. I collected my things from Vicky's place and moved into the Sparrows' apartment where Dennis, the lead guitarist, showed me guitar parts for various songs in the band's repertoire. I in turn showed them songs like The Pusher and Hoochie Coochie Man, which the band added to its inventory. Now, my induction into the Sparrows coincided with the departure of Art Ayre, the band's pianist who returned to his jazz roots. To fill the keyboard vacancy, Nick the bass player had called organist John Goldsby, who jumped at the offer. Not surprising, considering he was working as a shoe salesman at the time. On the upcoming weekend, the Sparrows were booked to play a $1,000 date at the Lutheran University in Waterloo, Ontario. The first gig with 2 new musicians in the band. Serious rehearsals were needed and were to take place in Oshawa near Toronto. Dennis the guitarist and his brother Jerry the drummer, the sons of Owen McCrohan, owner of the Jubilee Ballroom in Oshawa, grew up hearing many bands and performers at the ballroom, and after the Beatles and the British Invasion hit, formed Jack London and the Sparrows with singer Dave Martin, who became Jack London, and the McCrohan brothers became Dennis and Jerry Edmonton.
Don't rush your life, you should take your time. If you go too fast, you're gonna knock yourself out trying. Take it slow, 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 and easy.
The band had a couple of regional hit singles, but then had a falling out with Jack London and fired him. I learned all this on the way to Oshawa in the band's Chevy station wagon, which towed a trailer with band gear. After setting up the equipment at their father's place, we rehearsed around 20 songs, most of which had simple 1-4-5 chord changes. So it didn't take very long before we thought we were ready to face the kids in Waterloo. And we were right. The crowd, which was several hundred deep, and the largest I had faced at this point, got into it early and stayed with us until the last song was played. Being part of a band was a new and exciting feeling, and when we clicked and got into the groove, I got goosebumps. I knew right then I wanted more of that feeling, and I had found a new home. On the next episode, the Sparrows get a record deal, move to New York City, later to LA's Sunset Strip, and finally to San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury. You will also meet Jutta, the love of my life and lifelong partner, without whom they would not have been a band called Steppenwolf. So until then, thanks for listening, stay well, and stay wild.
Thank you for joining us on Rockstar to Wildlife Advocate from wherever you get your podcasts and from our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/RSTWA. Be sure to follow us and don't forget to subscribe for free so you won't miss any upcoming episodes. Rockstar to Wildlife Advocate is brought to you in part by the Maukay Foundation. Please visit maukay.org to learn about our efforts to protect wildlife. That's MAUEKAY.org. We hope to see you again on the next episode of Rockstar to Wildlife Advocate.